Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the What You Don't Hear podcast. This is a 15-minute Friday where myself and a returning guest talk about a specific topic in hopes to leave you with some maybe thought-provoking or positive advice to carry into your weekend, or I suppose whenever you do actually listen to this, if you don't listen to it on a Friday. But the goal is to leave you with something to think about or some actionable advice to take in to whenever you're trying something new. And the returning guest for this episode is my dear friend, Leah. Leah, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ross. I always enjoy it. We always have a great time.
I appreciate that. Sounded very scripted and good. You're sticking to the script.
I'm blinking. Can you see that I need help?
Thank
S-O.
Thank you for sticking to the script. I appreciate that a lot. But I'm very stoked that you were down to do these. Again, we like to talk a lot.
We do.
I knew that you would be a very good one for these 15-minute Fridays because we can just riff. We can just pack what would normally be 3 to 4 to maybe 6 or more hours into 15 or 20 minutes. And this one in particular, I feel like is a subject that is both broad yet very specific.
Yes.
Because the topic itself is very specific, but it can, in a broad way, be involved in literally anything. Not a Broadway as in like a theater Broadway, but we
enjoyed those as well.
A broad way. In this episode, it's going to be a Broadway episode, and you're just going to sing us through all the topics.
You know what? We should do that one day because I would be really stoked about it.
That would be incredible. Like, all right, guys, for the next 15 minutes, you're going to hear positive advice sang to you by Leah.
Show tune style.
That would be incredible.
Show tune Saturday. Stay tuned.
15-minute Friday, show tune Saturday. Man, I think you just helped me create a new.
You know what? We're just gonna have a whole week planned out eventually.
Yeah, folks, I really hope you like this podcast because I'm about to have every single day of the week giving you some sort of content. So the topic of this episode is dealing and working through anxiety and depression and how that plays into managing your expectations. And also working through failure. So we've got kind of a loaded basket here in this episode.
Absolutely.
We got a lot to uncover, but I think that nowadays in modern times, it's becoming more of a, I guess, open conversation for a lot of people to talk about their anxiety, their depression. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I feel like it's a word or a phrase that gets thrown around a lot. You know, you get somebody who's just sort of having a bad day and they're like, oh my God, I'm depressed. But I think there's definitely actual layers to that of like when depression and anxiety can truly get in the way and actually kind of prevent you from pursuing something.
Absolutely.
Or getting around something. So those are major hurdles. And you and I have had some good conversations about how we have both directly dealt with those sort of things. And so I'll just say this at the start. I'll say it again at the end probably. But I appreciate you being down to even talk about this subject on this episode and on this podcast.
Of course. And you know what? It is very important, and it does kind of get thrown around a lot nowadays. I feel like a lot of people, you know, especially our age and younger, are doing the I hate my life, same, you know, and it's ironically funny to some people, I guess, but to some of us it really is an everyday struggle, you know, that we go through. So I think it's important to talk about it because there are people that I think might not even realize that they're being ironically funny to themselves, but to other people that are actually going through these things, it's not really the same kind of joking around kind of feel about it. So
when I hate to be that guy, I've started our timer, by the way, so our 15 minutes is rolling. I hate to be that guy and say this, but like I honestly don't like the self-deprecating humor that much.
Mm-hmm. I've taken part in it. I think we definitely all have, just because it's easier to just go same. Like when you see something that's like somebody standing in a garbage can that's on fire and you're just like, yeah, same. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So
I've shared the "this is fine" meme before. I love that. Yeah.
I have a friend that's like, I'm going to tattoo that on me. And I was like, yep.
Mm-hmm.
Same.
Like, I will live vicariously through that tattoo.
Exactly. I think we've all like taken part in this, like, I don't want to call it a millennial thing or a generational thing, but I think that like it's just become a lot more normalized for people to just like outwardly say those things, but obviously not mean them. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it's also something that most of the people that are making those jokes, we actually suffer from those things like behind the scenes.
So let me ask you this. Why do you think it's probably just because humor is easy, but serious topics are hard.
Yeah.
But why do you think it's more acceptable to kind of be self-deprecating, but it's just sort of turning the corner of being acceptable to have those open conversations?
I think honestly, the only barrier between those things is having the strength to come out and say, like, no, actually, I'm struggling. And I think that I've held myself back from talking about problems in the past because I thought I'm oversharing. People don't care. And I think that those are just the little voices in our heads that, when you're having those problems in the first place, those are the things that you're dealing with, are, those inner, like, struggles of nobody wants to hear me talk about this for real. So when you say those things like, oh yeah, like, just set me on fire, man, I'm jumping off a bridge today, like, wish me luck, like, when we say that kind of stuff, like, there are people literally that, like, struggle with those things, and even behind those statements maybe they're struggling with those things, but if they were like, no, you know what, I'm actually having a really hard time right now, like, it could turn into a really productive conversation if you can overcome that boundary in your own mind of, this person doesn't want to hear me talk about this.
Yes. I mean, and that kind of goes into like confidence in doing something, because I mean, it's like, trust me, like doing a podcast and doing so many of them soon to be every day of the week, I still am like, no one wants to hear me talk about this. No one you know what I mean? But it's in my mind in some place where I'm like, yeah, but these conversations need to be
They
had.
need to be said.
You know what I mean?
Things that are important that need to be said.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just putting it out into the world, even if nobody hears things. I say stuff all the time when I release a song, when I do anything, I'll just be like, I don't even care if anybody sees this. I'll post it at 1 a.m. and just be like, whatever, at least I put it out there. Like, I put my feelings in this song and I got out what I needed to get out, and here it is. And if you don't want any of it, I don't really care.
Right. So shed some light for me on, I guess, your personal dealings with anxiety or depression, and maybe how that's affected things, or how you've then pushed through that and continued to go.
So I think a lot of my anxiety and depression actually stems from, and I have not been diagnosed with this, so I can't like honestly say that I have OCD, but based on a lot of the symptoms that I have of, I count numbers in my brain and I have to do things a certain way. There are a lot of things that I've kind of added up in a way that have made me realize that I think that's something that I'm dealing with. So a lot of, I think, my struggle comes from my obsessive compulsive need to have control over things and to kind of have my ducks in a row. And when, I have all these building blocks and I'm trying to make this big, picture come together, and if something falls out of place, and then I feel like everything falls apart. And so I personally have dealt with the anxiety of having to let go, and I think that that's honestly the best way you can deal with having OCD. I've literally listened to podcasts about this and things where they're like, you just have to like, oh, you're uncomfortable with that, you have to put yourself in that. And I'm like, oh, I don't like that. I don't like the sound of that at all. I don't think this is a good thing for me. But it is. I mean, you can't grow unless you put yourself in those situations.
Right. So what is it that you found that, let's say even on like your worst day, when it comes to whether it's pursuing a passion or a career or just even getting out of bed sometimes, what is it that you're like, hey, I can identify I'm having a really off day, but I'm still going to figure out how to get through it? Because I know I have those days all the time. It's like I can share all the positive stuff on the internet.
Of course.
But, there's still...
I think the other thing about the internet is that we're all putting our most positive things forward, and maybe we're all putting what we want people to see on the internet, and that makes it a huge thing. But as far as like things that I feel like help me to get just back into the swing of things, and some days I just can't. There are days that you're gonna have where if you're struggling from these things, sometimes you just feel defeated, and just being there alone is enough. You know what I mean? You might be laying in bed and you're like, I can't get out of bed today. And some days I can work through that, and there are days for sure where like it could be the afternoon maybe by the time I manage to get myself up and going. But I think a lot of it really stems from me looking at a bigger picture where I'm like, okay, I'm stuck in this bed. At least I have a bed, and at least I'm able to identify that like I am privileged in ways that some people aren't. And there are people that are working 10 times harder than me that have, you know, 10 times more talent than I do or 10 times more drive than I do, that are in positions where they're not capable of reaching their goals as easily as I am, or to even afford a bed or anything like that. And I have to constantly be checking myself, because something that, you know, I realized recently is that things aren't going to go my way all the time, because if they did, what kind of world would we be living in? Leah's world. We wouldn't be living in this world that we live in.
Yeah.
And I think there are days for sure where I'm like, wow, like it could just even be like me waking up and I feel like this is really hard for me to even just like exist today. And it sometimes stems from like a mental thing. Sometimes I don't know where it comes from, but I have to just kind of remind myself like, hey, like you have like great things and great people in your life and great opportunities, and you worked really hard for those things, and we're not just gonna let all of these bad feelings overshadow that.
Well, I think it kind of goes into the idea of like, just because something feels bad right now doesn't mean everything else is bad all the time. You know,
Exactly.
one bad day or one off day doesn't mean that your week has to be terrible. It doesn't mean that tomorrow has to be terrible. And I feel like that's something that I get caught up in it a lot, but it's something that I kind of continuously remind myself of. And
Yeah.
something that I love that you said that I feel like a lot of people don't think about enough, including myself, is perspective. Is to sit and say like, okay, this thing might be bad. However, this thing over here, well, that's good. And I can appreciate that. I can be thankful for that. And I feel like that's it's a cheesy thing to say and
It
to
is.
hear
And,
be said. But
and sometimes even in those moments where I'm like, okay, I'm talking to myself, and you know, or even Nick, you know, is very great about, no, you know what, you're doing great things right now. You know, this is going on for you. You've got this opportunity. Like you're doing really well, and you need to remember that. And sometimes it does feel cheesy, and it feels almost like, okay, we're just talking about this because I'm stuck in bed. But
Right.
to quote my favorite musical, even the darkest night will end and the sun will rise.
I love that. And
Always. And it's from Les Miserables. And when I when I watch that movie, I'm like, shit, like I think I got it bad. And you know, back then there's all these people like dying in the French Revolution, and you know, it's silly, but I have to literally look at things from a perspective of, you know what, not everything is gonna be perfect all the time, and when things are great, we appreciate them because we've been through some shit.
dude, perspective is a gigantic thing. And
Yeah.
and I honestly, I don't think I'm very good at that. I really don't. Like, genuinely, like hearing you say it out loud, I'm like, yeah, maybe I should get better at that. Because, you know, you've heard it be said 1,000 different ways before. And even, you know, there was a saying that I heard on another podcast that has always stuck with me, but I'm not, again, always great at identifying. And like what they were explaining was that anything that you think you don't have, you have something else in its place.
Okay.
So something that you feel like you're missing of like, oh, well, I don't have this thing, but there's something else that maybe you're not identifying that is a good thing that you do have.
Of course.
So it's sort of just shifting those focus and perspective to, well, what are the good things that you do have? Because while, you know, I think what that stems down to is it's easier to notice when things suck.
Oh, of course.
And it's a little more difficult to notice and be like, yeah, but at least I have this.
Of
You know what I
course.
mean? At least, like,
The silver lining is very often overshadowed by the negative. And I think that it's easy to look at the negative stuff and be like, well, this is in front of me right now and it's shitty. And there are so many days when I'm like, wow, I worked so late today, and I'm going to go home and go to bed, and then I'm going to wake up and do the same thing over. And realistically, like, I could be like, wow, but at least everything went according to plan. At least, you know, I was able to, you know, go to work today. I'm working in the middle of a pandemic where there are a lot of people that lost their jobs, that are, you know, working from home and don't get to have interaction with people every day like I do. And I feel like for the most part, like, I'm living a pretty normal life right now compared to most. And I feel like that alone is crazy. Because there are people suffering a lot mentally because they don't have the human interaction. And the longer you're away from it, the harder it is to get back into it.
Yes. And now, so something that we keep kind of bringing up as we're inching closer and closer to our 15 minutes, something that we keep kind of bringing up is the expectation part of it.
Yeah.
And managing those expectations. We said it at the top of the show, and now we can bring it back here towards the end.
Yeah.
Because it's been brought up a handful of times in these. So I guess, like, the floor is yours on just, like, how do you, whether good or bad, whether failure or success, how do you manage your expectations? Or how would you tell somebody who is dealing actively with heavy depression or anxiety or just worry all the time? You're always going to play out a scenario in your head and it's going to make you expect something different.
Of course.
So managing those expectations, I feel like, is a huge balance that goes into navigating this.
I am this is something I actually struggle a lot with expectations, whether it's expectations of other people or other situations. And again, it goes back to the fact that I have to accept that I don't get to control everything around me all the time. And so I've had a really hard time, especially in the last year, just realizing that sometimes I put my expectations too high for things, and I'm almost better off like preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. And that's something that I've had to sort of live by, because I feel like, unfortunately, as we get older, we realize like things aren't always going to come naturally or easily, and working through the hard stuff is honestly what makes it worthwhile in the long run anyway.
Yeah.
And so I feel like expectations are something I really have always struggled with. I'm a very ambitious person. I always try to see the best in people. And so when it comes to expectations of situations or of people, I find myself getting let down a lot, because I'm always like, well, why didn't this go the way that I planned? Or why were they not the person that I saw them as in my head? And what it really comes down to is I tend to fantasize in my brain of, like you said, like, this is how this situation is going to go, or this is how this person is going to be. And what it really comes down to at the end of all of it is people are who they are and situations are what they are, and they're going to be forever. That's just, it's the way that the world works. And it's not always going to be something that is preferable, but you have to learn how to accept these things. And something that I've also been realizing more recently is just the aspect of like, I can't control everything around me, but I can control what situations I put myself in.
Yeah.
And who I'm exposing myself to and how I'm reacting to those situations. And I think that a lot of people overlook those things and don't think that they're important, but it really is everything.
And that's like the reaction part, I feel like, is the last big point that I want us to make is, I have said this so many times on this show, and I only say it so much now because I'm repeating what I've heard from other people, because I know what it taught me, and I'm not perfect at it. There are still days when something happens and I am just, I'm annoyed and overly annoyed, and I'm just like, oh, it's freaking dumb, whatever, that's stupid, it didn't work, like, come on, why wasn't it this way? My expectation was something different, or whatever it is. So I've said this so many times, but I will forever repeat it because I feel like I learned so much from it. And you just said it, is that what happens doesn't matter, your reaction to it does. And I feel like that plays into the feeling of depression or anxiety, because that can, it's like, if we'll get literal for a second, and let's say depression and anxiety, because it can feel like this, is literally like a monster inside you, right?
Of course.
When you're reacting in a more negative way, that's just going to feed that monster.
Absolutely.
It's going to feed that. So when you're having a bad day, and because a lot of the times depression or anxiety, it's not kicked off because of something directly happening.
Absolutely. It can just come from nowhere.
You can just wake up and be like, wow, today is not the day.
Yeah.
But yes, managing your expectations plays a part into that. But I really do think that even further than that completely ties in, is understand that your reaction to things can make something worse than what it is, just as bad as what it is, or maybe not as bad as maybe it'll initially feel.
And I think a big part of it too is obviously we can't control how we feel. If something hurts you, it hurts you. And we can't always control that, obviously. Like, I'm not saying like control your feelings better, because that's basically like seeing somebody in the wheelchair and just going, well, you know what, you should just walk it off.
Right.
Because anxiety and depression, what it really comes down to is it is a problem, and it is something that's hard to get through, and it's really common, especially like dealing with it. I'm sure you've had people react the same way to your anxiety and depression, is people saying, well, just stop worrying so much, or stop being upset, like just choose to feel better. Like my mom, I love her to death, and she's even said she doesn't quite understand it and she wishes she could better, but she's the kind of person that's like, oh, well, some days I don't want to get out of bed, but I just do. And I'm like, it's more complicated than that a lot of the time.
Yes.
But I think managing your expectations and your reactions, more so not like how you're going to feel when something happens, but more so what you're going to do when it happens.
Yes.
Because I'm very much a person, when it comes down to it, if there's a problem, I don't like to dwell on a problem. I like to look for a solution as soon as I can, because that's when I get rid of my anxiety and depression, because I go, okay, this is what happened, and yeah, I'm really upset about it, but what am I going to do from here?
Yes.
And that's what makes a huge difference for me.
So we've hit our time, but we've talked about a lot of really good stuff.
Absolutely.
I think.
I feel like I keep saying absolutely.
Absolutely, I agree. That's very podcast talk. Absolutely, our opinions matter so much. So before we completely wrap up, is there anything? Because I feel like this is, again, it's such a big topic that, like, I really do. Anybody who watches or listens to this episode, I want them to take away something out of anything, anything that we just ranted about, anything at all. Is there anything that you want to leave, like, lasting words with anybody? If one, like, any last thing that you're like, okay, we sort of touched on this, but we didn't. Here's the thing I really want to say to anybody trying to work through their depression or their anxiety. Anything come to mind?
I think that we can all relate to the fact, and again, this is just reiteration at this point, but we can all relate to the fact of what we've both said of this is a very temporary feeling. And I think that anybody that is familiar with having anxiety and depression, or even bipolar disorder, manic, things like that, you know how temporary those things are, and letting them get the best of you for too long because you don't realize like things will get better, that's, I think, where it becomes a bigger problem. So if you are struggling with something and you're not sure that you can pull yourself out of that, don't be afraid to cross that barrier of reaching out and talking to people, because what's the worst that's going to happen? You know what I mean? If you trust somebody, if you really trust somebody enough that you think I can talk about my feelings with them, or even if you don't know somebody that well, but you think, I feel like this person has gone through things that they would understand where I'm coming from, don't be afraid to cross that boundary, because the worst that's going to happen is you're going to basically come out of it learning something. Even if somebody comes back and they're like, listen, I don't have a lot of information that I can give you about this, they usually, like in my experience, and I've been in the last couple of years very open about how I feel and like how I've been dealing with things, and I feel like the more open you are about things, the more you're going to be surprised at how many other people can relate to you, and it honestly makes a world of a difference knowing you're not alone.
Yes.
And that you can at least talk to somebody about it.
And knowing that, like, they might not have the answer for you, but at a bare minimum, if they can listen, sometimes that's what feels great in the moment.
Venting is wonderful.
Venting is
Talking
incredible.
is great. We love talking.
We love talking, clearly. But at the end of it, knowing there is a solution.
Absolutely.
There is a way through.
Absolutely. There's always things will always get better. And if you feel like you're at rock bottom, the only place you can go from rock bottom is up.
Yes, 100%. I think we end it on that. That was a wonderful 15-minute Friday. I appreciate you for sharing all that.
I appreciate you for listening.
See, that's how it works. That is how to be a good listener. Well, if you want to be a good listener and you want to make me very happy, you can follow the podcast around the internet at WYDH Pod, or on a real note, if anything in this conversation, in this episode, or anything that this podcast or any of its guests ever share about any topics like this make you want to have a conversation, 100% reach out. I am always willing to have these conversations. It doesn't have to be about business or freelance or creativity or anything like that. Clearly, we've already said it. You've heard it. Both Leah and I love to talk a lot.
We sure do.
The DMs are always open. So if you do want to chat about any of this sort of stuff, you can follow me, you can find me, you can message me at Who's Ross Theisen. And Leah, if they want to talk to you about any of this stuff, if they want to get to know you a little bit better or ask you more questions about anything that we just talked about, where can they find you on the internet?
I've been pretty quiet on Twitter as of late, but I am always on there. I believe I change it so much. I believe it's Ohelia. It's OHELLEAH. And my Instagram is Leah Earth with no spaces. And I think my thing is private. I might not see messages right away, but I try to check them as often as I can, as well as my Facebook messages, which my name fully is Leah Ingram. I get a good amount of messages on there actually about this kind of stuff, a decent amount. And I feel like, again, I can talk forever. So
Yeah.
I'm always open to, discussing things like this if anybody's going through something and they aren't really sure where to go, who to reach out to. Ross and I, we got you, because we can talk.
We can talk. We can talk. We can talk about the deep things. We can talk about the jokes. We can talk about anything and everything in between. But no more talking for this episode. That was a 15-minute Friday that landed around, I don't know, like 23 minutes or so. So it's normal for these things. Leah, thank you so much.